A Mack Ride Extreme Spinner. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the answer everyone was expecting. And for good reason too. This is the one roller coaster that I truly believe Cedar Point needs. It just seems like the most logical fit for Cedar Point. And sure, there are other roller coaster models they could get. But, you know, come on. We all want an extreme spinner over something like an infinity coaster. It's just a better option. But why do I think an extreme spinner in particular is the best fit for Cedar Point? Again, there are a lot of good coasters out there, and some rides could objectively be a better match. Well, to appropriately justify my reasoning, we first have to look at Cedar Point as a whole. First off, I'm pretty sure all of you are familiar with Cedar Point. They are the roller coaster capital of the world. I know, it's a groundbreaking statement, and I'm sure nobody has ever given this park that title before, but is there really any other way to describe Cedar Point? This is the park you go to for outstanding roller coasters. Cedar Point has always had a strategy of focusing on quality over quantity. They've done this for years. They only get roller coasters that they know will be a good fit for the park. Well, more or less. Cedar Point is by definition a top-tier amusement park. And I don't say that lightly. Only a few parks in my mind can ever reach that S-tier status. Maybe a park like Busch Gardens Tampa, Hershey Park, or even Magic Mountain can be at or near the same caliber as Cedar Point. But I don't know, even though there are a lot of good parks in America, I always find myself going back to Cedar Point the most. Is it the fact that I like the setting of the park more, given that it's on a lake? Or is it because I just like the roller coasters a lot more at Cedar Point? Well, yeah, those are the exact reasons why I like Cedar Point more. It all comes down to execution. Cedar Point, they have a great collection of roller coasters. And remember how I said they focus more on quality over quantity? Well, I'm gonna redact my statement just a tad, because even though they focus on quality, they still have a freaking large collection of roller coasters. Cedar Point alone is ranked number 4 for the amount of roller coasters they own. In 2025, they're gonna have 18 operating roller coasters. The only parks that have more operating roller coasters than Cedar Point are Canada's Wonderland, Energylandia, and Magic Mountain. But here's the main difference between Cedar Point and those parks. They don't pad their collection with kiddie coasters. Almost every single ride that Cedar Point owns, they're all massive. Most are 200 plus feet. And any type of coaster that you could possibly want, it's likely at Cedar Point. You want a Giga? There you go. You want a hybrid coaster with the most airtime in the world? Go ahead, buddy. Steel Vengeance is waiting for you. You want a giant strata coaster that's now the only one of its kind? We'll get back to you on that. And now in 2025, they're getting a tilt coaster, a model that is very scarce. We have been waiting for the revitalization of the tilt coaster for over 20 years. Vekoma, the sole manufacturer of the tilt coaster, that's not a Chinese knockoff, they have only ever produced one of these models back in the early 2000s over in Taiwan. The tilt coaster's potential resurgence has been the topic of discussion for a long time now, and it only took until 2025 for Cedar Point to finally get the first one. And yes, I know, it wasn't originally for Cedar Point. It was supposed to go to Energylandia, then Six Flags Mexico, and then it just showed up here because Top Thrill 2 was a bust. But even though this ride wasn't technically for Cedar Point, it's the ride I always wanted Cedar Point to get. I always thought a tilt coaster would be a perfect fit for Cedar Point, because it's one of the only attractions that they don't really have. And yeah, I know they already have Valravn, but do you think a B&M dive coaster is on the same level as a Vekoma tilt? Not by a long shot. Siren's Curse is a ride that's a lot more snappy. Outside of the tilt feature, all the elements are back-to-back in quick succession, trying its best to eject you from your seat and throw you around like a ragdoll. Valravn, on the other hand, is nothing like Siren's Curse. Sure, it's got the drop gimmick, but it's completely different. You're not tilting over the drop, you're hanging over it. And compared to Siren's Curse, Valravn is basically just the drop and nothing else. There's no rapid-fire airtime hills, there's no whippy inversions. It's basically just 5 elements that are all drawn out, that are meant to be more graceful. In other words, not as intense. It's almost insulting to compare Siren's Curse to Valravn because they're fundamentally two different types of rides. Sure, the drop element is kind of similar if you squint at it, but everything else about Siren's Curse is vastly different compared to Valravn. And even if we disregard Valravn, you can't really compare Siren's Curse to any other ride at Cedar Point. Maybe you can draw similarities to Maverick, since they both have rapid-fire transitions, but the layouts are completely different, so this argument isn't really valid either. And just a side note, I know I'm getting a little off topic, but one more thing about Siren's Curse. There's a little rumor going around that Siren's Curse will only be at Cedar Point for 5 to 7 years before they relocate it to a different park. I don't know where that rumor came from. I personally don't believe it. Yeah, I know Siren's Curse wasn't intended for Cedar Point, but I don't think they would relocate it after 5 to 7 years. Again, I think this is a perfect addition for Cedar Point. And there's not really a reason to get rid of Siren's Curse. Like what, Cedar Point's gonna get rid of their new coaster in 5 years' time? Then what will happen? What else are you gonna put in this spot of land? This area is already very compact. It sits between Millennium Force, Valravn, and the road. The only coaster that can fit here is a compact ride. So if they remove Siren's Curse, what are they gonna get? A Gerstlauer Infinity Coaster? A Vekoma? That would be ironic because Siren's Curse is already a new generation Vekoma. There's not a lot of options for this spot of land, and the Tilt Coaster seems like the perfect fit. I know I'm kind of rambling, but when I heard this rumor, I thought it was ridiculous, so I just had to say my piece with it. But getting back on track, like I said, the Tilt Coaster is one of the only rides I think Cedar Point really needed. And the only other coaster I think they need is an Extreme Spinner. Cedar Point, they may have a lot of coasters, but they don't really have any rides that break the fourth dimension. And I don't mean like a real fourth dimension coaster, but that would be pretty cool. I mean something where the ride vehicle spins on a separate axis. Think of rides like, well, the Axis Coaster, a 4D coaster, or a spinner coaster. A coaster with a ride vehicle that isn't tidally locked. And yeah, Cedar Point, they do already have a spinner coaster with their Wild Mouse, but that's a Wild Mouse, who cares? I want that big, extreme spinner coaster like Ride to Happiness or an upscale Time Traveler. That would get my adrenaline pumping, and would really be the only coaster that could be a successor to Steel Vengeance. Remember when Steel Vengeance opened in, oh god, 2018, I am getting old. In Cedar Point, they were going on a little marketing campaign saying their next ride was going to be even better than Steel Vengeance. They were looking to top their new RMC hybrid. And as enthusiasts, we were all pretty pumped. We were all speculating what this ride could be. And it turns out it was nothing. Cedar Point never built this coaster. It was all tongue-in-cheek marketing. But you know, if they actually went through on the plans on an Extreme Spinner, then they would truly top Steel Vengeance. I think it's the only ride that could. Or an RMC T-Rex, but that's never happening. But besides the Extreme Spinner, is there any other coaster model that Cedar Point could really use? Well, yes, actually. I had 2 other roller coaster models in mind that would have been a great fit at Cedar Point. However, I didn't pick them because I honestly don't see them happening anytime soon at Cedar Point. If you're wondering what these coasters were, one of them was a GCI wooden coaster. I thought that could have been a good fit, especially since Cedar Point, they don't really have any good wooden coasters. I've said on record before on this channel that I think Blue Streak is the worst roller coaster at Cedar Point. I don't agree with that sentiment anymore. I don't think Blue Streak is that bad after a few re-rides I got on last year. I would never call it a terrible ride anymore, but I would never call it anything above average. Cedar Point could definitely do better than Blue Streak. Other than that, we got attractions like Gemini, which isn't even a wooden coaster. It's a dueling aero coaster, and I would prefer it if they got rid of this ride. It's not fun, quite painful actually. So if Cedar Point doesn't really have any good wooden coasters, then why don't they get a GCI? It seems like a perfect match. Well, there's 2 reasons for why I do not think a GCI would work at Cedar Point. My first reason? Well, Kings Island is down the road. They are the wooden coaster park, and they already have a GCI with Mystic Timbers. So why would they add one at Cedar Cedar Point when Kings Island is 2 hours away? Wouldn't it be better to keep these parks more distinct? Make sure there's no clones or overlap between the two, so there's a reason to go to each location? I think so. But if not for that, I just do not think a GCI would be popular at Cedar Point. Cedar Point, they have a lot of high-class rides, and I do not think a GCI would even crack the top 5. Think about every park that has a GCI and an RMC together. Which one do you think would be more popular? Spoiler, it's the RMC. With Dollywood, most people prefer a Lightning Rod over Thunderhead. Magic Mountain, Twisted Colossus over Apocalypse. Hershey Park, Wildcat over Lightning Racer. A GCI would just blend in at Cedar Point. It would never stand out. The only way a GCI would work at this park is if it was a family coaster, like Wicker Man. Cedar Point, in its current state, they barely have any family rides, so a GCI wooden coaster that was more family-oriented would be a better fit compared to an extreme GCI like Mystic. But besides the GCI wooden coaster concept, the only other ride I think Cedar Point would need is a flyer, and not a B&M flying coaster, a Vekoma flying coaster. B&M flyers, those have kind of been out of circulation for a while now. The last park that bought one was, Universal Japan with Flying Dinosaur? B&M, they just don't really sell these anymore. Is it because they don't want to? Probably not. I think it's more because parks don't want to buy these models anymore. B&M, they just have way more successful products in their catalog, like the dive coaster, unfortunately. Parks just gobble those rides up. But even if we don't get any more flying coasters from B&M, I do think we'll see at least a few more flying coasters from Vekoma sometime in the future. Could Cedar Point be one of the buyers? Maybe. I don't think it would be anytime soon, however. Cedar Point, they just started working with Vekoma, and it doesn't seem like they're ready to jump into the deep end with this company just yet. But I'm not going to completely write out the possibility of them getting a flying coaster sometime down the line. But until then, out of my 3 options, I think the Extreme Spinner is the most likely and would be the best fit for Cedar Point. I just hope they get it one day. I mean, they basically already cleared the land for it. All they gotta do is build the ride. But for the love of God, Cedar Point, do not build a water coaster. That would be a tremendous letdown and a complete waste of land. Do not build this.